All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Jerry Bowyer, CEO of Bowyer Research, host of the Meeting of Minds podcast, and all around impressive conservative activist. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jerry.
Thank you, Richard. Pleasure to be with you.
So, we're in an interesting place in corporate America today. I think, if you look back about 5 years, I'd say things were very different. We had a lot of big name companies and brands coming out with a lot of left-wing political pledges and adopting, we call environmental, social, and governance ESG policies, on things like climate change and DEI, diversity in hiring. But I feel like over the past several months, certainly, we've seen a lot more public backlash against that. So for people who maybe have not been following this day by day, like some of us, how did that happen? How did that sort of backlash happen when a lot of us felt like it seemed like almost an overwhelming kind of tidal wave of this stuff was just kind of taking over corporate America?
Well, it was an overwhelming tidal wave, and this stuff was taking over corporate America. So that part of the perception, I think, was accurate. I think what was left out of that is that tidal waves recede. And why do they do that? Because water seeks its level. And ESG investing, and especially the real, almost extreme left-aligned activism, which kind of went way past earlier iterations of ESG, was so far away from sea level of American public opinion that the tidal wave was bound to dissipate. I mean, they just went too far. And there was a backlash because backlashes occur when you go too far. So, what's too far? Too far is um, Tractor Supply or John Deere with pronoun mandates, right?
Hmm.
That's too far. Not Ben and Jerry's. So I mean, that's kind of, or Harley Davidson, similar stuff. Harley Davidson, which builds these motorcycles that consume an awful lot of gasoline, hiring a CEO who is, what did he call himself? A sustainability, wasn't jihadi, was something like that. Taliban. So I think he said a member of the sustainability Taliban. So things just got crazy. And when you've got activists who are saying to oil and gas companies, maybe try not being an oil and gas company. That I think that, or to me, what was just absolutely blew me away. I'm not sure that it was the thing that triggered people. I think Disney and I think Disney and the parental rights and education, and Target and Bud Light, were probably the triggers of the backlash. But for me, when you had ESG activists promoting and proxy advisory services, allegedly the neutral subject matter experts
Hmm.
supporting proposals which were encouraging Coca-Cola, which is headquartered in Atlanta, in Georgia, right, to divest from states with heartbeat bills like Georgia,
Hmm.
or Walmart to divest from states with heartbeat bills, or TJ Maxx. Um, that was just such a bizarre overreach. That activated some legislators, especially in Texas, to say, "What are you doing here?"
Hmm.
So I think it was the overreach, and then there were different kinds of backlashes. So I don't know. I kind of like horror movies or horror novels,
Hmm.
and in the best horror novels, there's some monster that appears, and there's some kid in his neighborhood, and he sees some part of the monster, and there's some other kid someplace else, and she sees part of the monster, and eventually they all compare notes, and
Right.
say, "Oh, wait, it's real. I thought I imagined it," right?
Yeah.
And so, "Oh, well, what's it like?" "Well, it looks like a clown." "No, but it's also like a spider,
Yeah.
it's like a zombie." So what I saw is treasurers, state financial officers saying, "Wait a minute, you're downgrading our credit rating as a state." Marlo Oaks, treasurer of Utah, for instance, saw that. John Schroeder in Louisiana saying, "Wait a minute, you're debanking perfectly legal gun transactions. You're punishing gun store owners. And then so that you have state financial officers, and then you had shareholder people, like say my friend Justin Danhoff at Free
Mhm.
Enterprise Project, noticing what's going on there. And then you had, some legislators seeing what's going on and some state attorneys general. You also had some people who are kind of like internet personalities or TV personalities. Someone like Chris Rufo was getting some attention. You had
Mhm.
people at the Manhattan Institute who'd been sort of tracking this, but mainly from the standpoint of being aligned kind of with business, who were getting harassed by these left-wing proposals. So all these different groups are kind of coming together, and frequently the companies themselves saying, wait a minute, there's this thing going on. Do you see it too? Yes, I see it. I think a really big moment was when engine number one, with the help of Blackrock, elected members of the board of Exxon and
Mhm.
Chevron, who are essentially anti-energy activists. So it went too far. Different groups noticed it, started pushing back in their individual ways, and then coalesced in that backlash,
Mhm.
along with consumers who had brand revulsion against some of the sort of the kind of high profile sexual identity type posturing, and yet had companies coming out against the anti-energy stuff, and then then we started coordinating, and then others started. Then it became a thing, and then others started getting in, and a guy named Robbie Starbuck, who was a Twitter personality, started getting whistleblowers from inside these companies, giving them some stuff which was embarrassing to the companies. The vibe shift was a big thing too with the Trump, not just the Trump administration. The Trump administration flows in on the vibe shift. So I think it collapsed so quickly because it was such an overreach.
Mhm.
But that doesn't take human agency out of it. You had to have people pushing back, and you were one of them. You've
Mhm.
been doing that for a long time, and you've been a target, right? Attempts to defund CEI,
Mhm.
along with attempts to defund ALEC, and then later a State Financial Officers Foundation. They came after you. So they come after those who they consider a threat. So you ought to wear that as a badge of honor. So I think that's how I think that's why it was vulnerable. And then I think some people stepped up and pushed back. And I can tell you, I don't know what the rest of everyone else was told, but I was told, don't bother. You can't possibly win. It's inevitable.
Mhm.
And that was the counsel of despair. The Denethor answer did
Yeah.
not resonate with me.
Well, yeah, and I know. I mean, personally, I think that that was one of the biggest assets that I think ESG activists had was the sort of aura of inevitability that, uh, you know, to use another movie cultural analogy, they were sort of like Thanos. They insisted that they were inevitable and there's nothing you could do, that their sort of agenda was going to go forward. And I always like to use the example of the organization called Principles for Responsible Investment, which was sort of a spinoff of the United Nations. And they were one of the lead promoters of these things, getting companies to sign up to the sort of responsible investing list of things they're going to do and pledges. And, they had on their website, uh, an entire page dedicated to what they called the inevitable policy response, meaning that if if anyone said, well, I don't know if our company needs to do all these, say, climate pledge stuff because the Congress hasn't passed anything that says we have to cap greenhouse gases, so we'll just wait and see. They would say, but it's coming. All these things that we say, we're trying to get you to do, governments are gonna force you to do it eventually, and it's inevitable. So that's the inevitable policy response, the IPR. And they
Right.
convinced a lot of people that the policy response they were predicting was in fact inevitable. I think the last couple of years have shown that it not in fact inevitable
It's
and was.
actually quite evitable. So yeah, I mean, so that was the argument for stranded assets
Mhm.
declarations that, well, eventually all that oil and gas is going to be useless. So you might as well just, write down the asset to zero and take it as a cost. It's a stranded asset. And the politics went exactly in the opposite direction from not it would be overstating it to say that they predicted, excuse me, it would be understating to say that they predicted the policy direction. They confidently asserted as a premise an article of faith. So they have an eschatology. They have a
Mhm.
theology and an eschatology.
Yeah.
So they were in traditional Christian terms, they were post-millennialists. They were Puritan postmillennialists who believed in the inevitable triumph of their secular kingdom, of the kingdom of man, and Gretaism will become, the law of the universe. And all of the politics have gone, not all, but overwhelmingly the politics have gone against them. So
Hmm.
my question is to companies and asset managers and proxy advisory services and the whole system, why did you believe them? Just because they're confident? Is that all? Or because they had subject matter experts without paying attention to the fact that the subject matter experts at McKinsey were consultants in the transition. So
Hmm.
they had a stake in the inevitable narrative. And since it's clearly not inevitable, then how are we adjusting in the future to how we respond to these narratives of inevitability? And that wasn't just energy. That was basically, if you don't come down against guns now, eventually the millennials are going to take over and then they're going to hate you because you were last,
Hmm.
right? So there's a lot of that kind of rhetoric. Like you want to be, for brand power, you want to be ahead of the curve,
Hmm.
not behind the curve in banning guns. Well, guess what? Citigroup just got rid of its ban on transactions having to do with firearms. It now treats firearms the same as it did everything else. So the brand risk was getting on board with ESG, not
Hmm.
being too slow that they have now had to reverse themselves from.
Well, yeah, I think you've definitely seen that with some of the big banks who have been trying to furiously backpedal from debanking accusations, right? So the activists said, well, you should come in and you should like stop working with certain small business clients, or you should start, you should sort of put reputational risk into your corporate accounting standards and things like that. And they tried to say, oh, well, you'll look bad if you're the last big bank to adopt this. And of course, now it's the ones that adopted it that are running scared away from that reputation.
Right. I mean, they were first in, to into this social mania, right? And now they have to back off from that, which is worse than if they'd never joined,
Hmm.
because they look inconsistent and fickle. So again, we're kind of past the point of, oh, that's great, you're back to neutral or whatever. The far from back to neutral, but you're moving in the right direction too. What is it about you structurally that makes you susceptible to this stuff? And I don't know exactly what it is. It might be that they're in kind of a social bubble. I don't live in Manhattan. I never have. I visit once in a while. I don't live in San Francisco. Again, I visit once in a while. Same for Los Angeles or Chicago. Or they went to Ivy League schools, and so maybe that's what it is. Or sometimes I think so their daughters won't be mad at them for being CEOs or something like that. There's some social, what do they call this? Sacred canopy, is what the sociologists of knowledge call it, that made it seem like this was really safe to get on board with every single letter, as far as you could, and to get as far away from guns and fossil fuels as you could. Do they not know anybody like us? Well, frankly, having spoken to a lot of them, I get the sense that they don't. Because I've had so many conversations, mostly with the proxy advisory services, but even with the IR departments of the companies, they have never met someone of my species. And by the way, I'm not a crazy right winger. I'm a classical liberal. So if you haven't met someone like
Like
me,
me.
you should meet some of my neighbors. Yeah. So they're just, their plausibility structures are extremely limited. So, and here's the problem is that, and I've tried to explain this to them, conservatives are not transactional the way left wing activists are. Left wing
Hmm.
activists tend to be professional activists. They're on the payroll, right? Of Soros or whatever. They come in, they do their deal. Now they're going to come back next year and ask for more, and they figure that out now.
Hmm.
But they're professional activists. But with us, conservatives, meemaws and pop pops like Jerry and Susan, I mean, we're paying attention, but most aren't. So we have this general sense everything's okay with corporate America, and then wait, what's that? And wait, what's that? And then all of a sudden we wake up like a grumpy bear in the middle of hibernation season,
Hmm.
saying, "What's the matter?" And we stay angry for a long time, and we're not really making strong distinctions. So in talking to someone, what kind of through back channel, what I got back from Blackrock was, hey, you signed that business roundtable thing and you championed that, and that's a stakeholder capitalism. And their answer is that's a million years ago. Well, it's a million years ago to you, but I can tell you that the negativity about BlackRock in my neighborhood of blue collar Americans in Western Pennsylvania is trending. It still has momentum against BlackRock.
Hmm.
It thinks you're causing the floods in Kentucky, right? And you're
Hmm.
the reason that real estate prices are high. So once you've broken a relationship with us, it can't be like a little transactional thing. Hey, we did something with Jerry. Go tell all your friends, because we don't have a central command, really.
Right.
That's the real stranded cost, isn't it? Pandering to the left, harming your brand. I mean, Bud Light still hasn't, been able to bounce back. I mean, they're sponsoring slap fight competitions where crazy muscle bound men are slapping each other in the face, and they're still seen as a compromised brand by manly men.
Yeah, I know. I interviewed Anson Frericks, who's a former Bud Light marketing guy who wrote a book about the whole his career at Bud Light, and then at the end included the furor over their like trans influencer marketing campaign they did, and how that was so controversial. And it's interesting. He when in his book, and then when we were talking, he was saying uh, that that you know, dramatic, one-time marketing thing they did for March Madness got a lot of attention, but that was after he left. But his point was that he thought that the company had been kind of losing its way for a long time and had been doing a lot of like interest group pandering way before it got to that one sort of like trans celebrity
Right.
that everyone talked about. So I want to jump back really quickly to what you said about the, professional, left-wing activists will come back and make demands for your company, and if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. They'll come back and get more. I just finished reading a book about the history of the Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Saxon England, and how people who know that history, there were the English, and then the Vikings came, and at first they thought that they could deal with the Vikings by paying them off, by giving them money.
The Dana Gold.
The Dane Geld, right? It said if you
Yeah, Dana Gold, right.
and so what people learned is if the bullies come and you pay them to go away, well, you're just training them to come back.
Yeah, didn't Kipling have a poem about that?
Yeah.
Once you pay the Dana Gold, the you'll never be free of the Dane.
Hmm.
And I do think they figured that out now to some degree. So when I talk to IR departments, I say, so now you understand they're going to move the goalpost.
Hmm.
Now they probably stopped moving the goalpost because they've lost so much ground, but when they have momentum, they keep moving the goalpost. So yeah, I'll say something about global warming and net zero by 2050, or I'll say something a goal about cage-free eggs by 2025 in 2020. So that seems like a long time away. None of them have cage-free eggs by 2025. That's now, okay?
Hmm.
So now they're saying, well, we couldn't really do it. Sorry, we tried. And it's like, well, but why even put this stuff out there? And I think there's a kind of a seduction to it. Like, we're not asking you to guarantee it. Can you at least set a goal? But then once they've set a goal, they act disappointed as though they guaranteed it.
Hmm.
So I think for some of them, they thought if I just start a DEI department, our business is done here. But for the left wing activists, that is the beginning of a marriage,
Hmm.
not the end of a transaction.
Right.
So they have to kind of pull back from it,
Yeah.
because that's the thing about leftism. This is what I think is different about leftism than conservatism. Conservatism does not have an infinite vector ideology.
Hmm.
And so if you're as conservative as you can be, then you don't want to change anything, right? So no change is your goal, right? But a leftist has it's not just it's not, leftism is not a position, it's a direction. So it just
Hmm.
keeps going on forever and ever and ever. And that's why we can be dealt with. So when I talk to IR, I say, here's the difference between us and the other side. If you go back to neutral, we'll get out of your hair. If you do what we ask, we're done. If you do what the other side asks, that's a promissory note for you're bonded forever.
Right. I mean, it's sort of a way what Thomas Sowell talked about in having a constrained versus unconstrained view of the world.
Yes.
So the there are various theories about and which might be mutually compatible with where a lot of the stuff came from in the first place. And so we talked about sort of outside activists harassing companies, and certainly environmental activists have been doing that for decades. They uh, put on a harness and get up on top of a company's headquarters building and unfurl a giant uh, banner that says the CEO is a murderer, because he's like killing polar bears. Um, Another theory that I think a lot of people on the sort of like libertarian, classical, liberal, conservative side have talked about is the internal pressure of woke employees, right? The activist in HR or the person who gets hired to be the director of DEI or whatever. But then the third one, which I tend to focus on, since we work a lot on government regulation at CEI, is government agencies and government officials sort of pressuring companies in this direction, even if
Yes.
it's not a particular mandate, right? If the president of the United States gets up and gives a speech and he says, well, we're going to go net zero by 2035, meaning no more oil and gas, right? Um, and we're going to have an all of government approach. Every single institution in the federal government is going to be pushing everything in this direction.
Mhm.
Like, well, what does that say to people who are ExxonMobil shareholders, right? That's a not so subtle influence on the market.
Right.
Um, so one reason, at least in the short term, I think be kind of optimistic about this is that in say under the Biden years, you had, and then before that, under the Obama years, you had a lot of people who worked at, again, people no one's ever heard of, people who worked at the FDIC and who were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and who were, worked for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currencies, agency most people don't even know exists, who were trying to push financial institutions in these directions.
Agreed.
Right.
Right.
Uh,
So what I would say is some financial institutions resisted. A lot of them were just a cheap date for that. So they could have pushed back. So because you can push back against government sometimes. So we kind of grade them on a curve a little bit. We get that there was pressure under the Biden administration to take down, medical misinformation, which might be something like maybe COVID isn't going to kill 300 million people, like the early, really dodgy math imperial, college, research models showed, right? Or even crazy stuff, like, vaccines are a bioweapon that have little microchips so the Antichrist can track you or whatever. So there's legitimate stuff. Jay Bhattacharya got taken down, serious scientist, and also crazies got taken down. So there was a lot of Biden pressure there, and Facebook said, "Hey, look, it was an existential, crisis for us." Okay, that's fine. So we talked to Apple a little bit about some of the takedown stuff from the Chinese government, like taking down some Quran apps and some Christian Bible apps. And they said, well, it was a government order. And I said, the FBI asked you to unlock the phone of a guy who went and shot up a naval base to see if he had co-conspirators who were going to kill other people. And you fought like hell against that.
mm,
So, I mean, you're willing to fight against government sometimes.
mhm,
Maybe you don't like the FBI and law enforcement so much. And so all of a sudden you become a privacy fanatic when it's our side. But the Chi-Coms, taking down Bible apps, that's fine. So they could have fought back. So for instance, some of these big energy companies, I get that you had a certain direction politically, but maybe the best answer wasn't to split the difference with anti-oil and gas people. Maybe the answer would have been for them to go to war politically. Now, I don't want them going to war politically over whatever, voter ID. It's not
mhm.
relevant, okay? But maybe go to war politically over oil and gas if it's 98% of your revenues.
Right.
So it seems like when the left comes along, they get into different splitting. And when the right comes along, they'll fight like crazy. So I think they maybe need to realign a little bit. And I think we have maybe a little bit of a board member crisis to some degree. We need board members who are thoroughly committed to fiduciary responsibility. And so, you've heard me say this probably at some conferences. The pendulum goes left, the pendulum goes right. It's not a problem that the pendulum went left. It's not a solution that the pendulum went right. The problem is that it's a pendulum.
Mhm. Right.
So we just need, if we get that right, we need a stake in the ground, not a pendulum, in cement. Shareholder return. That's your job. Everything else is a distraction. Anybody else comes to your office with anything else, tell them, get out. You don't belong here.
Mhm.
Well, but you agree with me. Sure. Approach me at home for a private donation. But here at work, we're an oil company. We're a tech company. Yes, we are going to do government work. We at Google, instead, we're not going to do anything with the U.S. military. We're going to work for the U.S. military. Why? Because they're a customer and
Mhm.
we're a business. If you get that right, then all the little distractions can be dealt with in just one idea. You are a distraction. We're not doing any distractions.
Well, yeah, and I think I mean, that is um, that's a good analogy, the sort of stake in the ground versus the pendulum. And speaking of things that I have heard you say at conferences, there was one, you and I believe Kevin Freeman from Economic War Room were on the same panel, and there was a lot of talk about, companies and brands, adopting crazy policies and ad campaigns, and someone asked about whether we should cultivate pro-conservative brands instead. Like, should we have the Ben and Jerry's? Do we have the left-wing ice cream company? Do we want the Patriot ice cream company instead? And one of you, you can tell me if you remember, said, I don't want to have to set up a right-wing version of every company in America, right? The goal is not left-wing Coke and right-wing Coke and left-wing ice cream and right-wing ice cream. We just want companies to focus on their core business, and that shouldn't, and also that shouldn't be too much to ask, right?
Right. Yeah, and why should there be left-wing Coke and right-wing Coke? I mean, if they weren't getting involved with political distractions, there's nothing about the cola drink market that inherently has to divide up ideologically.
Mhm.
And there's nothing about the ice cream market that has to do that as well. Now, I get that sometimes ideology is relevant, say maybe a lobbying firm, right, or a public relations firm. So there might be issues like one of the things that we run with that you've heard me talk about conferences as well is let's say you're a red state and your financial consultant or your asset manager is ESG aligned and they're pushing ESG with your money. Well, you're probably not going to get much of anywhere with them. You're going to fight them all the time. So get some. So when it's ideologically sensitive, like what should your proxy voting policies be? Someone who agrees with you is probably pretty helpful. Because it doesn't seem to be practical. But other than that, large businesses benefit from economies of scale, and there's absolutely no reason to have broad consumer products with political or ideological affinities. We're only talking about that because the broad consumer products got captured by the left. So we're talking about creating a counterculture on the right called the parallel economy. I'm agnostic on, maybe some good entrepreneurial stories will come out of the parallel economy. Okay. So yeah, you want to buy Black Rifle coffee, that's fine. We bought some Black Rifle coffee. It's good coffee, all right. But some kind of idea that we conservatives have an obligation to always support the counter, we have to use Patriot Mobile or whatever. No, we are all going to make our own decisions about that. And it might work or it might not work. Sometimes you might have a brand revulsion. You're like, I'm done with such and such company. And that's fine. But I think in general, the gold standard would be large consumer, high scale, multinational corporations being politically neutral. And then we don't have to have countercultural conservative institutions. I think that's what I'd rather see. So my friend David Bahnsen has said, we don't really need Christian diaper companies,
Mhm.
right? But I also get if you've got diaper companies that are giving money to Planned Parenthood, I can get why someone would reform a Christian diaper company.
Yeah.
And if we were going to buy, a lifetime's not a lifetime supply of diapers, but 2 year supply of diapers for grandkids, we might go to the Christian diaper company just to say, I'm sorry, the other diaper company is giving money to Planned Parenthood. That's offensive to me. But really, that's a fallback maneuver. And I think if we conservatives are fully engaged properly, we get these companies back to neutral, which to me would mean it becomes normal for us, for our institutions to vote our proxies. And for me, the biggest thing, and this was such a great disappointment to me, blue states vote like blue states, and red states vote like blue states,
Right.
right? If the $3 trillion of red state money starts voting anti-ESG and anti-DEI, that's it. We're done. Then we're all back to just diapers and cola,
Right.
and not having to set up Patriot Cola, which I guess is the opposite of Royal Crown Cola. Now that I think about it, because that's British. Anyway, I don't want a parallel economy, but if it's forced on us, then, and in some cases it is relevant.
Mhm.
In some cases, and I do think red states have learned now that if they're doing business with ideologically aligned institutions, especially in politically sensitive areas like corporate engagement and proxy voting, they're going to get the opposite of what they think they're going to get.
Right.
So
So,
anyway,
so yeah, in a big, complicated, consumer-oriented economy, we're always going to have some niche brands and companies that will cater to specific interests. But the overall vision of what we're hoping for America is not that every brand has to take a an ideologically predetermined side.
right.
And and so, I want to get to the big wigs, the people who are, pulling the strings, and there's few bigger companies, and certainly no bigger asset manager than BlackRock, a company that has become oddly very controversial with leftists because they have a sort of conspiracy theory about how people in finance control the world in some nefarious way, and then conservatives because of some of the political stances, especially that BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has taken on like environmental issues and things.
Right.
So so you had a chance to talk to them and give them your 2 cents about the big picture. What should capitalism look like? Shareholders versus stakeholders. Well, how did you find yourself in that position? And then what did you tell them?
Well, I found myself in that position because one of the service areas, one of the things that Bowyer Research does, is to help shareholders place proposals on the ballot of companies. One of our clients in that is Patron Partners, a Houston-based financial services firm, and we worked with one of their clients to place a proposal on the ballot with BlackRock, a client who is a BlackRock shareholder. Excuse me. And generally, these clients don't like to make speeches to boards of directors and C-suites. They delegate that. They typically delegate to their financial advisor, their Rick Figueroa, but he had a schedule conflict, so that got delegated to me. So I gave that speech to BlackRock. By the way, the conversations leading up to the speech were reasonable and productive. Not productive enough to drop the proposal, but I feel like we came close. And my point was pretty simple. BlackRock's an amazing company, has a tremendous success record. Its stock has been underperforming for the past 5 years, and I think it's reasonable to posit that part of that is the shift towards stakeholder away from shareholder capitalism, which caused a political backlash. And then I simply listed all the red states who divested from them, by name, and basically said affirm shareholder capitalism, shareholder primacy, and live that way. And I think that'll be great for the company. It's not confrontational. I'm not an activist. My clients are investors who are investing for return. So we're on the side of the company. We're not against BlackRock.
Mhm.
This shareholder owns shares in BlackRock. They're not hoping for BlackRock to crater. They want
Mhm.
BlackRock to do well, right? It's their retirement it's in their retirement plan. Okay, so we just want them to do the right thing by shareholders. So I feel like, you know, I think there's still room for progress there, but I think BlackRock has a lot of repair to do. with the other half of the country. And as I explained to them, the Business Roundtable statement of 2019 might be a million years ago to you, but it's recent memory to most of the people that I deal with. And some of the things Larry Fink has said about forcing behaviors
Mhm.
is very recent memory. So it's going to take a lot for
Well,
you to win back the trust of those people.
yeah, and I remember that, and for our listeners who might uh, not have read about it at the time. So in 2019, the Business Roundtable is a group of CEOs where it's sort of interesting that it's structured as, say, like the Chamber of Commerce is structured as like companies join the Chamber of Commerce, but the Business Roundtable, the CEO as an individual is like the named member, and so the sort of the idea that they when the Business Roundtable does things or promotes things, the idea is that their individual CEO members are going to go out and kind of be evangelists for this, whatever was decided that they're all announcing they're in favor of. And so, they had this statement 6 years ago about the meaning and purpose of a corporation, and so for the first time they used phrases like the idea of stakeholders were like, well, it's not just the shareholders that we're worried about. It's all of these stakeholders, where it's our customers, it's our employees, it's, the community, the environment at large, and things like this. And, that set off a big, earned media firestorm of, criticism back and forth, and they got a lot of press out of it. Um, but, I wrote a little, blog post at the time, having read it, and it it said like their pledges were like, well, we pledge to treat our employees well. We pledge to have, they probably didn't say honorable, that would be too moralistic for them, but we will have ethical relationships with our suppliers, and we'll do these sort of generally, you might expect, bare minimum things to be a good company, because those are our stakeholders, and they're important, not just the shareholders. But the funny thing when I was reading through that, when I wrote at the time, was if you had gone to any of these CEOs or their corporate spokespeople a week ago and asked them, "Are you doing all these things? Are you respecting your
I
employees?
would have said we're
Are you?"
doing them.
Of
Yes,
course, they
right.
would have. Everyone's. Of
So
course,
what's
we're
the
doing
point of
that.
the big
Right.
hullabaloo, right?
So what's the deal then? Right. They're sort of, on the one hand, they're trying to sort of virtue signal that they're great, wonderful people, but the only thing they're theoretically committing to are sort of the bare minimum things anyone would say they were doing anyway. Uh, so there was,
Yeah,
I
and
was,
we did a number of follow-ups during annual meetings, and we said, "What changed?" And they said nothing changed. We were already doing this. So what the answer is, then what's the point of this statement? I mean, what I think the statement was almost like deliberately ambiguous. I think there was a sense capitalism is over. The millennials, they don't want capitalism. They're socialists. We need to kind of redo the deal. I think they misread the populist moment as being a left-wing populism
Mhm.
rather than a right-wing populism. And so they said a lot of stuff which was fuzzy, right?
Mhm.
So yes, you're going to treat employees well, you're going to treat, suppliers well, et cetera. So is that a change or not? I think it did suggest a change, but without being sort of legally actionable.
Mhm.
So I mean, the way to do that would have been to say, we believe in treating our employees well because as subordinated to the goal of shareholder return. So
Mhm.
here's our data, and there is data like companies who are the 100 best companies to work for. Last time I ran the data myself, did overperform, right?
Mhm.
So taking your stakeholder idea and subordinating it to the primacy of the shareholder would have been an acceptable approach. And by the way, that's what we're asking for now. That's what we asked BlackRock for. We didn't say tell your stakeholders to go jump in a lake.
Mhm.
What we said is affirm the primacy of the shareholder.
Right.
And they weren't they didn't. Maybe more time they would have. So I think that business roundtable thing is kind of fuzzy and like I think it signals some kind of vague vibe shift, kind of. But you didn't really know what you were signing up for, and they didn't really know what they were signing up for. But I think it also creates a rationale because I mean, you listen to the annual meetings, and I've sat through so many of them. They talk like stakeholder capitalists, not shareholder capitalists. At least they were for years.
Mhm.
Everything is virtue signaling. I mean, just their opening 15-minute video is just sustainable, this, diverse, that. I'll just like you would think that you weren't an auto parts store, that you were a women's study department at a Seven Sisters college, the way you're
Mhm.
just like, or whatever, any grievance studies major. I mean,
Mhm.
they don't sound like companies anymore.
Mhm.
So, I mean, they really, something shifted for real. And then we see with the behaviors, like I said, when you've got John Deere
Mhm.
and you've got Tractor Supply and you've got Harley Davidson with some really out there, like, report your coworker if they complain about trans bathrooms.
Mhm.
Again, not Ben and Jerry's. That something shifted. How do we know something shifted? Because something shifted.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because things really changed inside, and they sprouted a bunch of DEI programs, and some of them had the sense to shut them down. So, what I like to say to companies is, have you learned yet that HR works for the company and DEI works on the company?
Right.
Learned that yet.
Yeah.
They are an activist group paid by you to lobby you. And that comes out of the 2019 thing.
Yeah. And,
Comes out of the business roundtable.
yeah. And I know, Jerry, I could talk about this all day. But uh, at the in the interest of keeping our listeners on track for their day and not taking up all of their time either, I just want to wrap up with one question here. So, you talked about how some of these pledges, like the 2019 Business Roundtable pledge, are sort of like fuzzy and vague, and then actually, in and of themselves don't commit the companies and the CEOs to anything specific. But of course, plenty of individual companies have made very specific pledges that are now, as we've said, sort of difficult to go back on or uncomfortable to admit when they're not achieved. So some of the policies that sort of fall under this aegis of ESG in general, whether it's every company supposedly has to go net zero on fossil fuels, those might be kind of excessive or unnecessary in some cases. Maybe pay slightly more for the energy your company's using, but other ones like say like race conscious hiring and promotion requirements, especially in the current legal environment, might actually be illegal, right? There might be violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for example, that the assistant attorney general in charge of civil rights in the current administration is probably taking seriously. Um, so when you think about this, you talk to companies and investment managers and IR people, like how do you sort these sort of various levels of risks and threats, right? Because you might be able to give them very good long-term kind of political advice about like you guys are probably going in the wrong direction with this, but then there's also things that are like a much more specific live legal risk that you could point to.
Yes, and we do tend to, kind of key in on very specific legal risks. So when we're talking to IBM, where the CEO was sort of caught on camera, he didn't know it was going to get leaked, saying, well, we're not going to promote any manager who's promoting white people, or like similar type language, just blatantly illegal, crazy talk, to just kind of zoom in and say, you've got to stop this now. We can talk about other things later, but where you have that kind of, legally risky stuff. And I'd say that's probably where there's most of the legal risk when it comes to the companies. Now, there's other stuff going on, like companies, what we see because of the American Airlines ruling, where a company where BlackRock is a major shareholder, then it maybe has BlackRock managing the 401k, or it's voting ESG in its
Mhm.
401k plan, and doesn't have any non-ESG options in its 401k plan. Well, that's a legal liability now too. And I think that I don't think these folks understand how much of a storm is coming at them. I
Mhm.
just don't think they get it. The Trump administration is not the George W. Bush administration. It's not the Ronald Reagan administration. a lot of them don't like business. This is the new right. This isn't, Ronald Reagan, who was a spokesman for GE for most of his life.
Mhm.
So the goodwill is used up. They are going to use the power that they have, and they are going to use the norm breaking precedents of the Biden administration in post norm ways to go after these companies. And I've tried to tell them, they're starting to see. So the publicly traded companies, I would say another would be the proxy advisory service. I just don't think they have any idea what. Well, now they do with, was it 2337 and Texas coming down the pike and attorneys general. I mean, that they are so used to being able to count on conservatives to be essentially passive
Mhm.
or don't go so far so fast,
Mhm.
brake pedaling the leftward tilt a little bit, that I don't think they know what they're up against. So I think there's a lot of liability all over the place in ways that, I'm having trouble, predicting, because the Trump administration, for good or for ill, is committed to rolling back ESG and DEI.
Yes, the administration may be using all its power and possibly more than its actual power to
Yes, it might
to
be using
advance.
more than its constitutional power.
Mm.
That this president is an executive order president, and the left constructed alphabet agencies and gave them enormous authority. Guess what? You built something that now somebody else controls.
Mhm.
So let that be a lesson to all of us. I mean, I'm more classical liberal in my orientation. Whenever you're building a power or an institution of government, just imagine the politician you hate the most. Just imagine Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, wielding that power and say,
Mm.
do I want to create this monster?
Uh, Words of wisdom to live by. So, Jerry, thank you so much. This has been so much fun, but I think also very instructive for our viewers and listeners. But before we go, tell people where they can find all of your great stuff. Because you're doing all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. So there's a BoyerResearch.com website, but that's basically our proxy voting guidelines,
Hmm.
or information about that. And a lot of people approach us and say, well, how can we, get your help? We don't do retail. Like we don't help individual investors vote their proxies, but we do with financial advisors. So if there's somebody who's saying, I want to know how I'm voting and I want to fix it, and I might even want to engage, do proposals, I would say reach out to me on social media, but pretty soon I'm going to ask you to introduce me to your financial advisor because we work institution to institution.
Hmm.
And I mean, we are still losing 98% to 2% frequently on very common sense proposals. And that's because conservatives have entrusted their votes to left aligned institutions. And there are easy fixes to that. And the first thing I ask anybody is, do you know how you voted last week? Because you did. Last week, somebody voted with your money.
Hmm.
Did they vote to say, hey, Lululemon, it's perfectly great that you gave money to Black Lives Matter, which said looting is just fine, and to Reclaim the Block, which said we should defund the police, even though they're a retail company? How did you vote on that? Well, I can tell you 98%, 97% probability you said it's fine, Lululemon. And
Hmm.
we see this over. You don't like debanking, you hate debanking. Basically, anti-debanking proposals are getting maybe 3% support. So the vast majority of people listening right now who hate debanking, it's high probability that you sided with the bank against the victims of debanking. So I would like to see it become normal for financial advisors to take responsibility. This is part of the diligence, not just how risk aligned are you or what are your retirement goals, but is your money weaponized against you? And what I'm finding is they're so used to just running the system and making the money, they don't want to think about it. So advisors talk to me about fixing it only when their clients say, hey, I want to know. I want to know how I voted on Lululemon. I want to know how I voted on cutting Israel off from access to the cloud at
Hmm.
Amazon because there was a proposal to do that, right? Did I vote for or against? Did I vote to disarm Israel in the midst of an existential war. And I've seen high profile, super conservative, super pro Israel asset managers on
Hmm.
TV saying Colombia is terrible. And then I look at their voting record and they're voting for these abominable divest and punish Israel stuff. So if you've got an asset manager or financial advisor, that's my pitch. Ask them. And if they don't know, send them to me, and I'll help them find out, and then help them not weaponize your money against you. Now, in general, people want to follow what I'm talking about. I'm on social media. I'm on X and LinkedIn and Facebook. Bowyer is Bowyer. The spelling matters. So Jerry Lee Bowyer at Twitter or Jerry Bowyer at on Facebook or LinkedIn. Pretty easy to find because I'm pretty active.
Yeah, he's a one-man content machine. Follow this guy, take back your shareholder rights, and vote your values. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, Richard.